June 9th, 2016. It's Thursday morning in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the state's capital and second most populous city.
Compared to New Orleans, it's much more straight-laced and conservative.
It's more of a settling down community, a great place to raise a family.
There are a lot of hard-working 9-to-5 kind of people.
But as medical transport driver Leslie Parms is on his way to work that morning, something stops him in his tracks.
On my way in to the office, I saw a little girl standing by the street holding a pillow.
She seemed distressed, confused, and traumatized.
Concerned, Leslie gets out of his van to check on the little girl.
She was just kind of discombobulated.
Somebody with you?
When she doesn't respond, he decides to call 911.
I didn't feel comfortable leaving such a small young child there by themselves.
I don't see nobody.
With dispatch on the line, Leslie continues to ask the little girl questions.
Where was her mom? Where's her dad? Where does she live?
Do you know where your mommy's car is?
At that point, she points to a car parked across the parking lot from where she's standing.
Can we go there? All right, we're gonna take her to the car.
At the car, Leslie gives the dispatcher the plate number.
Yeah, it's a Louisiana tag, B8-99380.
They identify the car as belonging to Lintel, Washington.
But there's no sight of her anywhere.
You stay right here.
Then, as Leslie steps closer, he makes a shocking discovery.
There was a big pool of blood. Something bad had happened.
Yeah, you better get a police car here quick.
Single mother Lintel Washington had a strong passion for teaching.
She was always a teacher. She had made that decision because she just wanted to touch kids' lives.
Teaching was her heart. She was so good at what she did.
She was actually voted Teacher of the Year in 2014 to 2015.
You don't get that award by being a killjoy. You're someone that people enjoy being around.
While her career was an unqualified success, her personal life had always been a struggle.
Originally from New Orleans, she married very young.
This was a way for her to get out of her strict household, her strict upbringing.
But unfortunately, no sooner than she got married, about 3 weeks later, she was already getting divorced.
After that, she met another man named Darren Schaefer at a barbecue.
It was like kismet, an immediate connection. They got to know each other, started dating.
Things seemed good, and after about a year, Lintel was pregnant.
She had suffered from fibroids, and the doctor had told her for years that she couldn't be a mother. So she was really elated, very excited, because she always wanted to be a mom.
But by the time their daughter was born, her relationship with Darren had ended.
He had his own demons that he was fighting, and so she became a single mom.
Although Lintel was a bit heartbroken, she bounced back.
She moved to Baton Rouge looking for a fresh start.
The fresh start also came with a new job doing what she loved.
One day she calls, she's excited. She's like, hey, I have the job.
And it was there that she met Dr. Robert Marks.
Robert had a PhD and was one of the school's assistant principals.
Hey.
Hi.
How's the new job going?
It's going great.
She tells me, she says, girl, homeboy was watching me like he saw God.
Well, we're lucky to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
It was clear that Dr. Marks had his eye on Lintel.
He continued to approach her. He continues to be thoughtful, continue to be nice.
For Lintel, he checked all the boxes.
Lintel was thrilled because Robert was successful. He had a PhD.
He's whining and dining her. He's spending time with her and her daughter.
They are spending the night at Lintel's house. They are taking trips together.
He just was giving her this exhilarating feeling and some excitement in her life.
They also started talking about a future together.
And at the end of 2015, Lintel was pregnant again with her second child.
There's a phone call that comes and she's pregnant. I asked her, what did he say? She says, girl, he is so happy.
He wants her to have this child, and that makes her even more happy that things are gonna move in that direction of marriage.
Yeah, I got a little girl here.
But now, a good Samaritan has just found Lintel's little girl wandering alone near her mother's abandoned car and called 911.
He's telling them it appears someone has been really harmed.
There was just too much blood for somebody just to have an accident or a fight.
I'll get public assist. Found a 3-year-old in the parking lot. Child's wearing pink shirt. 15, I'll be en route.
When an officer arrives on the scene, he confirms the car is Lintel's.
Lintel's purse and keys are in the front seat.
So this is just not an abandonment of a child, it seems. What is really going on?
But when they try to ask Lintel's daughter what happened, what they get is hard to follow.
They ask her, well, where's mommy?
Do you know where your mommy is?
Mommy's asleep in the lake.
Single mother and beloved teacher Lintel Washington had finally found the man of her dreams in Dr. Robert Marks.
He's the assistant principal of her school and the father of her unborn child.
She's just so happy that she found someone of his caliber, his education.
She was smitten by him. He's her Mr. Right.
But now police have been dispatched to a parking lot where Lintel's daughter was found wandering alone.
Lintel's car is nearby. Her purse and keys are in the front seat, and there is a considerable amount of blood in the back seat.
Based on the amount of blood, it appears that something terrible has happened to Lintel.
The car looked like a murder scene.
However, there are no weapons or shell cases or anything pointing to what may have caused the injury.
There's also no blood spatter consistent with a stabbing or a shooting.
It's just blood pooled.
This tells police that whatever happened to Lintel, it didn't happen in that car. It likely happened before she got to the car.
The other piece of evidence that they found was this one sandal in the car.
So exactly what happened and how her car ended up in the parking lot is unclear.
Was this a kidnapping? Was this a murder?
But the officer suspects Lintel's daughter might have witnessed whatever happened to her mother.
There's blood on her foot.
And the little girl appears traumatized by the ordeal.
Emotionally clutching a pillow, that's a sign for I need security, I'm scared.
Figuring she needs time to recover from the shock, police call for a special victims unit.
They assist the police in securing this young lady and getting her into a safe place.
I need homicide and SVU to my location.
In the meantime, detectives arrive and quickly begin their investigation.
Detectives find a surveillance camera on a nearby building, and they ask to see the footage.
Possible if we can get the footage of that?
Management immediately sends them the footage from that morning, and it shows Lintel's daughter wandering aimlessly around the parking lot.
It was just the way Leslie Parms said he found her.
Scrolling back, detectives find Lintel's car pulling into the parking lot about 11:30 p.m., but it's too dark to tell who's behind the wheel.
It's also not clear how many people are actually in the car.
So they're a little bit stuck because there are not clues about where Lintel is, what happened to her.
The only thing they know for sure is that Lintel's little girl spent the night in the parking lot.
That's a long time, so thank goodness she was safe, given the circumstances.
Next, detectives contact the school where Lintel works.
They learned she didn't show up for work that morning. She also didn't call in.
That was very unusual for Lintel because she had a pretty good track record of showing up, being reliable.
One of Lintel's co-workers, named Janet Foster, ends up speaking with investigators.
This was her supervisor turned friend.
And when she finds out that her daughter had been wandering around aimlessly, she is adamant that there's no way Lintel would leave her daughter alone at all.
She was always a very attentive mother.
Okay, could you come down here and speak with us?
I'm on my way now.
She immediately stops what she's doing and goes directly to that scene.
On the way, she also reaches out to Lintel's emergency contact, her best friend, Melissa.
She starts to explain that she didn't know where she was. And she says, they found her car. And so she's in Baton Rouge, I'm in New Orleans. And I'm like, well, what else? She said, well, they found her daughter wandering around in the parking lot.
Melissa agrees with Janet.
Lintel would never leave her daughter in that type of situation. So we knew something was wrong.
When Janet arrives, she's shocked by the scene.
She was not expecting to see what she saw, which was a lot of yellow tape.
And as she approached, she was told it's a crime scene.
When she explains she works with Lintel, she's immediately connected with detectives.
She said she wants to help in any way she can.
How well did you know Lintel?
We were close, real close.
She also reveals to police that there's an assistant principal that works there by the name of Robert Marks. And Robert Marks was in a relationship with Lintel.
Not only is Lintel dating the assistant principal, Robert Marks, she's also about 7.5 months pregnant with this child.
There's just one small problem.
Dr. Robert Marks is married, but not to Lintel.
How well do you know Lintel?
Detectives investigating the strange disappearance of Lintel Washington have learned that the 40-year-old teacher is dating a married man and is pregnant with his child.
From the beginning, she was like, hold on, aren't you married? Why are you pursuing me?
Wait, you coming on a little strong for a married man, ain't you?
It's not what you think.
But he tells her that I'm going through a divorce and my marriage been over. Like he was just there.
Now, Dr. Marks is successful, and he says this is a big house, so they are able to have their separate areas.
Then this 2-story house, she's upstairs, he's downstairs.
He says they didn't sleep together, but they are going through the motions because they have 2 children.
And that's when Lintel's hesitation started to fade away.
Dr. Mark's perspective is he wants a clean divorce. He doesn't want to hurt the children and even his wife any more than they have to.
He didn't want the relationship to come out too soon.
So he asked her, can we kind of keep this quiet? Because he didn't want the soon-to-be ex-wife to use this in a courtroom.
Stop answering.
It was already somewhat of an inappropriate relationship because it was a workplace relationship. So there's probably some complexities to the relationship because of that.
Janet tells detectives that once the divorce was finalized, the plan was to go public with their relationship.
She trusted what Dr. Marks said, and she continued on with the relationship with the understanding that she's not a homewrecker. The marriage is over.
In her mind, it made sense, and he truly wanted to be in this relationship with Lintel.
And what gave Dr. Marks some veracity to his claims that he was truly getting divorced is all the times they have spent with one another.
When she calls, he's answering. He's at the house. He's spending the night. He's not moving like a married man.
Lintel is thinking, my heart trusts this because 9 times out of 10, he's here with me.
Then she got pregnant.
Soon, the couple was starting to plan their future together.
He wanted to adopt her daughter. They were actually looking for apartments. She was in a 1-bedroom. And she calls and she tells me that they went to go look at the 2-bedroom.
He loved her. They were going to be a family.
But then, Janet says that things suddenly changed.
At the beginning of June, Robert suddenly stopped answering her calls.
I spoke with her Saturday. She's upset because she hadn't heard from him since Thursday.
Lintel was just beginning to start to teach summer school, and she was curious as to where he was.
So, Janet says that Lintel came to her.
She wanted to know if Janet knew where Robert might be.
She asked me if he took off work.
And had he?
Yeah, for a family reunion.
Still, there's no reason he can't send a text message to say, hey, I'm busy, I'll call you later.
Something in her gut was like, hold on, something's not right. You're going to a family reunion and you have ghosted me. You're not responding to me. I have your child.
That's when Lintel started to look up Robert on social media, and she discovers his wife's Facebook page.
She says something that knocks her socks off.
Hey. Girl, are you sitting down? You have to see this.
She tells me to type in his wife's name. And when I type it in, I see what she saw. And I saw Robert Marks and his wife. She's standing next to him.
She sees her man and Angela Marks very much in love.
Now you tell me, does this look like a couple that's getting a divorce to you?
No. And to make matters worse, it doesn't look much like a family reunion. They're on a cruise together.
If a picture can have 1,000 words, it says, married is married, he is not going anywhere.
Janet says Lintel was devastated.
She's crying, she's upset, she was broken.
What are you gonna do?
Ooh, she says, he just ruined my life, and I am going to tell his wife.
She gets into panic mode.
Lintel tracks down Robert's address,
but nothing could prepare her for the next shock.
She sees not a palatial estate as Dr. Robert Marks had described.
She's mortified when she discovers it is a mobile home.
According to her friend Janet, Robert Marks had been lying to Lintel Washington about his pending divorce, and a lot more.
Not only were he and his wife still very much together, but he also wasn't as well off and successful as he made himself out to be.
What really did it wasn't a 2-story house. But the wife was upstairs and he was downstairs. And she saw that it was a trailer.
In a trailer park.
For Lintel, in her mind, Robert has been giving her this like snowball of lies. And seeing this trailer is like this snowball coming to the bottom of the hill and exploding.
She's feeling really played, and she's in so much pain emotionally that I was trying to calm her down.
I don't know. People are gonna just think I'm a homewrecker. No one is gonna care that he lied to me.
She asked me, do you think I should see him face to face? And I tell her, yes. You need to look him in his eyes.
So she decided to set up a meeting with him.
Once Robert got back from his cruise, Lintel arranged to meet with him.
She was going to tell him that he was not going to just walk away and leave her to support their child on her own. If that's what he thought, he was mistaken.
The meeting was supposed to be on Wednesday night, the night before the police found Lintel's car.
Now it appears to detectives that Robert may have had a motive to harm Lintel.
They believe that if his wife found out, she would leave him.
After all they've learned, detectives contact Robert and ask him to come in for questioning.
They let him know that they're looking for Lintel. He says he tried to call her this morning and he didn't get an answer.
They ask him point blank, did you meet up with Lintel? And he's open and honest about it.
Yeah, we met up in a Walmart in the parking lot.
Dr. Marks tell the detectives that when they met, he came in his motorcycle and she came in her car.
He says they talked for half an hour and then he left and he rode around to a local sports bar.
He said, I watched the game for a while and I had a couple of beers and I went home for the evening.
As far as other interactions, he's denying that they spoke any further.
I'm gonna ask you straight up, did you do something to Lintel?
Absolutely not.
Because we don't believe she's just missing.
Oh my God, really?
They go on to explain that she is not just missing, she's hurt.
And there's a lot of blood in that car, Robert.
At which point, they ask him if his wife knew about the affair.
He says that his wife had no idea.
Robert also denies that Lintel ever threatened to tell his wife about the affair.
No, that'd be news to me.
Robert seems pretty convincing. He acts as though everything was fine.
After talking to Robert, detectives call his wife Angela down to the station to follow up.
They're wondering if maybe she found out about the affair.
Maybe she followed him that night and found out he met up with Lintel.
We'd like to talk to you about your husband.
But that seems less likely once detectives meet with her.
His what?
They talked to her about her husband and Lintel, and they disclosed to her that they've been having this affair.
Affair with Lintel.
She is shocked and genuinely devastated that Robert is seeing someone else.
No.
But she goes on to tell the police that Robert's not the type of person that she could see harming anybody.
Do you know where Robert
When
was
asked where Robert was on the night in question, she confirms he went out on his motorcycle.
He was going to go to the bar and have a few drinks and watch the game. And when he came home, she was in the bed asleep.
They ask her what she was doing that night, and she says she stayed home with the children.
The detectives, after questioning her for a period of time, they believe what she's telling them, and she seems pretty authentic and sincere.
I'll walk you out.
Robert's alibi is weak, but since he did admit to meeting Lintel that night, detectives follow up on that information first.
Detectives head to Walmart to see if they have a surveillance video.
But unfortunately, there's no footage of the parking lot.
So they go to the bar and they talk to the manager.
Detectives ask to review the restaurant's security footage from that night.
Nowhere on the video footage do they see Robert. And so this is starting to raise more red flags for the detectives.
But even without an alibi, can they actually place him at the scene?
That's what detectives are hoping to do when they're finally able to observe an interview with Lintel's little girl.
The Child Advocacy Center has counselors that work with children after there has been some trauma. One of those counselors sits down to talk to Lintel's daughter.
They get her comfortable and they start questioning her.
It soon becomes clear she not only witnessed what happened, she knew who was responsible.
Do you know who hurt your mommy?
Mr. Robbie.
In her interview with a child advocacy counselor, Lintel Washington's young daughter has just identified her mother's killer as Mr. Robbie.
The detectives assume that Mr. Robbie is Robert Marks.
This is the married man who Lintel had been having an affair with after he had wrongly led her to believe he was getting divorced.
Lintel and Robert had been in this relationship for a while. Who else could it be?
Lintel's daughter also says it was Mr. Robbie who put the blood in her mother's car.
They ask if she saw Mr. Robbie hurt Mommy, and she says yes. And she heard a boom when he hurt her mom.
The more the detectives hear Lintel's daughter speak, they are now starting to believe that Lintel has been shot.
Do you know where your mommy is right now?
Mr. Robbie put her in the lake.
So in the detective's mind, it's not if Lintel is alive. It's how do we go find her body?
Based on the daughter's statement, detectives secure a warrant for Robert's arrest and take him into custody.
They bring him in hopes that he will tell them where Lintel's body is, or at least what happened.
Instead, he invokes his right to an attorney and maintains his silence.
So they hit a dead end with Robert, but that doesn't stop their investigation.
Detectives still face the daunting task of finding Lintel.
And her daughter's statement of Mommy is in the lake doesn't exactly narrow things down geographically.
In a place like Baton Rouge, that could be anywhere.
You're in an area that is overrun with bayous and lakes.
There's also miles of drainage and irrigation canals.
And 630 square mile Lake Pontchartrain is only an hour away.
They're worried that if she's in one of these bayous, or if she's in one of these lakes, they won't be able to find the body.
Being that the detectives know that they have their work cut out for them, one of the first things they do is subpoena both Lintel's and Dr. Marks' cell phone records.
When detectives receive Lintel's phone records, they prove especially compelling when compared with Robert's cell phone data.
Lintel and Robert did meet up at the parking lot that night.
The data trail shows that both phones are traveling individually to the same location. Then both phones travel together at a location north of Baton Rouge.
This is near where the sheriff's department has a pistol range.
They move from the gun range and they go across the Mississippi River.
They travel via the Huey Long Bridge to rural Iberville Parish.
This is roughly a 40-minute drive, depending on traffic.
Both phone stops in the vicinity of a small farming community, and then they head back to Baton Rouge.
And when they come back, you see that Lintel's phone suddenly goes dark.
It stops in the vicinity of University Lake.
It's just east of LSU's campus, and not far from the parking lot where Lintel's daughter and car were later found.
The detectives bring in the dive team to search.
Unfortunately, they are unable to locate Lintel's body.
So, the search continues.
It is a huge effort covering several miles. Miles of forests, fields, and bayous.
And because the area is remote and towers are relatively few and far between, it's harder to triangulate exactly where Lintel might be with any precision.
But then, after several days of searching unsuccessfully, authorities get a surprising call from a local farmer.
He had found a dead body in an irrigation ditch.
Five days after Lintel Washington disappeared from Baton Rouge, a local farmer has found a dead body in a drainage ditch.
It's discovered across the Mississippi River in rural Iberville Parish.
That's an area where phone records place both Lintel and her lover, Robert Marks, on the night she went missing.
When the body is discovered, it's so badly decomposed that no one can immediately identify it.
But detectives have little doubt. It is Lintel Washington.
The news of her likely discovery hits Lintel's family and friends hard.
In those 5 days, I kept thinking, she's unconscious. She's at a hospital. I just kept trying to hang on to some type of hope. So he let me know that she was not okay. I almost passed out.
When the autopsy results come back, they confirm the body is indeed Lintel's, and she died a violent death.
She was shot, one shot in the head at point-blank range.
But the part that really broke me was she wasn't killed right away. She actually lives to the next day. So maybe we could have saved her if we would have got to her sooner.
The report also confirms that she was carrying Robert's baby.
The fetus was far enough along that it could have survived if medical intervention had occurred.
As a result, the prosecutors charged Dr. Marks not only for the death of Lintel, but also for the death of her unborn child.
But as tragic as the autopsy results are, will the prosecutors be able to secure a conviction?
There's only circumstantial evidence.
When the trial begins on December 13th, 2021, prosecutors lay out their case.
Prosecutors proposed that when Lintel asked to meet up that night, he saw an opportunity to get rid of his problem.
You got some explaining to do.
I know, but can we not do this here?
Come on.
He gets off his motorcycle, gets in the car with Lintel and her child, and that they drive to another location to talk.
He takes her out to the shooting range.
We need to talk.
Not in front of your daughter.
They get out the car.
Yeah, I don't think she can hear us out here.
But she does hear what comes next.
He pulls the gun and shoots her.
Remember, the little girl said she heard a big boom.
Then he loads her in the car and he drives her across the river and dumps her body.
From there, Robert headed back into town. likely tossing Lintel's phone in the lake as he drove by.
He then brings the car back and drops it off in the parking lot with her daughter in the car.
He abandons the car and heads back to his motorcycle.
It was not something in the heat of the moment. This is something he actually planned.
But this elaborate plan had one glaring hole.
Lintel's little girl.
He was really hoping that something happened to her indirectly. She could have been kidnapped. She could have been hit by a car.
Anyone could have came along and picked that child up, and no one would have been the wiser.
But he was wrong.
So, prosecutors have Lintel's daughter take the stand.
They don't ask her many questions, but they do play the video of her telling what happened to her mom.
Hearing the emotion and the innocence, that was raw.
I was so proud of her daughter because all the things her mom taught her, she implemented. She was still, yes, sir, no, sir.
But will a little girl's taped testimony be enough evidence to convict a well-respected man?
The defense certainly tries to cast doubt.
In trial, he sat there as if he was going to get off.
They refrained from mounting a strong cross-examination of Lintel's daughter, but instead accused the child's counselors of misconduct.
The defense says that Lintel's daughter was coached.
They also point out that there is no murder weapon or DNA tying Robert to the crime.
So without her testimony, there's not enough evidence to convict Robert Marks.
But their efforts are in vain.
After hearing the entire case, it's pretty obvious that the jury didn't believe Robert's defense team's theory of what happened. And they came back with a guilty verdict in 30 minutes.
The mountain of evidence that the prosecution had, you could not refute it.
He was convicted on all charges.
The judge sentences him to life without parole.
There were tears of joy that swift justice had been served.
Poor Lintel was looking for love and a family, and she met with Robert Marks.
That was a cold man. No one else mattered but him. Then that's what put him behind bars.
His calculating web of lies ultimately took 2 innocent lives.
No one deserves to be killed because they made a decision to be involved with someone. And that unborn child didn't even have the opportunity to live.
She didn't do anything wrong. She just trusted him. And now she's gone because he was the one that was lusting and lying.
Lintel's memory now lives on in her daughter. She's been raised by her father, and he can see the intelligence in her, and he sees a lot of Lintel in his daughter.
She has a long, hard road in front of her. I hope and I pray that she can grow up and finds peace someday.
And while Lintel's daughter may only have a few memories of her, she can know that she stood up for her mother when it mattered.
I think it's important to tell the story of Lintel. I think it's important for her daughter to know that there are people that are still praying and supporting her. And I think it's important so that other women, if they find themselves in a situation similar to this, get out. Don't take any chances.
There are crimes that leave behind fingerprints. There are crimes that leave behind weapons, photographs, witnesses, a trail of blood that points directly toward the person responsible. And then there are crimes where almost everything is deliberately erased, where fire becomes the final weapon, where a human body is reduced to fragments, where investigators are left staring at what appears to be the end of every possible answer. On a summer morning in 1991, in Vancouver, British Columbia, a janitor discovered something smoldering inside a garbage dumpster. At first, it looked like refuse. Something burned. Something collapsed in on itself. Something that had already been consumed by an intense fire. Then the smell reached the people nearby. Police and fire crews were called. And within minutes, the discovery became something far darker. It was a human body. Or what remained of one. The fire had been so destructive that investigators could barely determine where the body ended and the burn material began. The remains had been reduced to a fraction of their original weight. Ordinary clues were gone. Skin was gone. Much of the soft tissue was gone. The biological evidence investigators normally depend upon had been destroyed. There was no face they could recognize.
No usable photograph. No obvious identification.
And no immediate answer to the question that mattered most. Who was she? The case began not with a name, but with a body that seemed almost impossible to identify. The victim had been burned so severely that even determining how she died presented a major challenge. Investigators could not simply examine the wounds as they would in an ordinary homicide. Fire had altered almost everything. But the skull remained. And inside that damaged skull were clues. An X-ray revealed fractures and metallic fragments consistent with gunshot wounds. Investigators now had something crucial. This had not been an accidental death. Someone had killed this woman. Someone had then tried to erase her. The question became whether the killer had succeeded. Across Vancouver, meanwhile, a woman was missing. Her name was Lynn Breeden. She was 30 years old. She had worked as a cocktail waitress at the No. 5 Orange, a gentleman's club in Vancouver. She had friends, acquaintances, a social circle, and a life that suddenly stopped. Lynn had last been seen after a night out. Then she vanished. A missing person report was eventually filed. At first, investigators had no reason to believe that the unidentified burned body in the dumpster was Lynn. There was simply too much destruction. But forensic examination began narrowing the possibilities. The remains suggested a woman in approximately the right age range. Dental examination provided additional information. Even after the fire, the teeth offered investigators something that the rest of the body could not. Identity. Slowly, the burned stranger began to become Lynn Breeden. And once the victim had a name, the investigation changed completely. Now detectives could reconstruct her final movements. They could ask who had seen her, who had been with her, who had spoken to her, who had followed her, and who might have had a reason to want her dead. The last known hours of Lynn's life led investigators into Vancouver's nightlife scene. It was a world of after-hours clubs, drugs, money, relationships, and people moving through the city long after most residents had gone to sleep. Lynn had been there. So had Chris Cruz. Cruz was 25. He was familiar with Lynn. He was also connected to the same social environment. And investigators would eventually discover that Cruz had something that did not belong to him. Lynn's belongings. But before detectives could establish a direct connection between Cruz and the burned body, another strange event occurred. Someone walked into a bank. The woman claimed to be Lynn Breeden. She attempted to withdraw thousands of dollars from Lynn's account. But there was one problem. The woman was not Lynn. The bank teller noticed something was wrong. The transaction failed. And surveillance cameras captured the attempt. Suddenly, the investigation had a new direction. A woman had tried to impersonate a murder victim whose body had been discovered burned inside a dumpster. The timing was impossible to ignore. Police identified the woman as Tanya Forrester. When questioned, Forrester provided information that would move the investigation toward Chris Cruz. She told police that Cruz had given her Lynn's wallet and identification. Cruz's explanation was that he had received Lynn's belongings from someone else, a friend. But detectives were not convinced, because Cruz had been at the same after-hours gathering as Lynn, and now he had her possessions. And someone connected to him had tried to empty her bank account. The pieces were beginning to move. But suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed physical evidence. They searched Cruz's vehicle, and what they found transformed the case. There was blood. Blood inside the car. Blood on objects connected to Cruz. There were other suspicious items. A gasoline container. A .22 caliber rifle. Clothing. A tire iron. And a necklace resembling the Playboy bunny pendant Lynn was known to wear. The evidence seemed to point toward Cruz. But there was a devastating problem. The body had been burned so badly that investigators could not obtain a conventional biological sample from Lynn that could be compared with the blood found in Cruz's vehicle. They had blood. They had a possible suspect. They had suspicious objects. They had circumstances that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. But they did not have the scientific bridge connecting that blood to Lynn. Without that connection, the case could remain circumstantial. And circumstantial evidence, no matter how disturbing, does not always tell a jury who committed a murder. The fire had destroyed the easiest answer. The killer may have believed that was enough. The body had been burned. The victim had been almost erased. The ordinary DNA sources were gone. And for investigators, that meant the most important question was suddenly not who had been near Lynn Breeden. It was whether anything biological had survived the fire. Something hidden. Something protected. Something the flames could not reach. The answer was sitting inside the remains. Inside the mouth. Inside the teeth. And nobody initially knew whether it would work. A forensic odontologist named Dr. David Sweet had been following the case. He understood the problem. The fire had destroyed the tissues normally used for DNA testing. But teeth were different. A tooth is hard. Dense. Protected. And some of Lynn's teeth were still embedded deep within the jawbone. If the outer structure had shielded the interior from the worst of the heat, there might still be living material inside. Tooth pulp. Genetic material. A final biological trace hidden inside a structure designed by nature to survive. The idea was extraordinary for the time. It had not been a routine forensic procedure. It was an experiment born from desperation. Investigators had almost nothing left. But they had a tooth. And if that tooth still contained usable DNA, it could answer the question that had been hanging over the investigation from the beginning. Whose blood was in Chris Cruz's car? The remains were sent for examination. The tooth was opened. The pulp was extracted. And then came the waiting. Because there was no guarantee that the DNA had survived. The fire had been powerful enough to destroy nearly everything else. It could have destroyed the genetic material too. If the test failed, investigators would still have the blood, the suspicious objects, the bank surveillance, the conflicting statements, and the growing chain of circumstantial evidence. But they would not have the link they desperately needed. The laboratory began processing the material. Scientists extracted cells from the tooth pulp. The DNA was separated and analyzed. Fragments were processed using the forensic techniques available at the time. The results would eventually be compared against biological material recovered from Cruz's vehicle. The entire investigation seemed to be waiting for a pattern. A match. A connection. Something that could turn suspicion into scientific evidence. And then the laboratory produced the result. The DNA inside Lynn Breeden's tooth had survived the fire. More importantly, the DNA profile matched the blood recovered from Chris Cruz's vehicle. The fire had failed. It had destroyed Lynn's skin. It had destroyed much of her body. It had almost erased the physical evidence of her life. but it had not erased everything. One protected fragment had survived, and that fragment gave investigators the connection they needed. The blood in Cruz's vehicle belonged to Lynn Breeden. The woman whose body had been discovered burning inside a dumpster was the same woman whose blood had been found in the vehicle of the man who had been connected to her final hours. The investigation had crossed a line. It was no longer simply a case of suspicion. The forensic evidence had become a direct link. And the strangest part was that the evidence had survived in the one place the fire had failed to destroy. Inside a tooth. The case would eventually lead to Chris Cruz being charged with Lynn Breeden's murder. But by then, the investigation had already become something larger than a single homicide. It had become a demonstration of what forensic science could recover when almost everything appeared lost. The killer had used fire to destroy evidence. The fire had destroyed almost everything. Almost. Because hidden beneath burned bone, protected within the structure of the jaw, a microscopic record of Lynn's life remained. And that record was enough to speak. Years later, people would remember the horror of the dumpster. They would remember the missing woman, the false bank withdrawal, the strange explanations, the blood, the gun, the gasoline, the necklace. But the decisive clue was smaller than all of them. A tooth. A fragment of biological evidence that should never have survived the inferno. Yet it did. And once scientists recovered the DNA from inside it, the fire could no longer protect the person responsible. The flames had erased Lynn Breeden's appearance. They had erased much of the crime scene. They had erased the evidence the killer apparently wanted gone forever. But they could not erase her genetic identity. And somewhere inside that burned and silent evidence was the answer investigators had been searching for. Not a confession. Not a witness. Not a dramatic discovery in the darkness. Just a tiny piece of Lynn that the fire could not reach. And sometimes in a murder investigation, that is all justice needs. The DNA result did not arrive with sirens. There was no dramatic knock on a door. No confession waiting in an interrogation room. No killer suddenly collapsing under the weight of a detective's accusation. There was only a laboratory result. A sequence of genetic markers. A comparison. A match. But in a homicide investigation where fire had erased almost every conventional clue, that quiet scientific result carried enormous weight. The blood recovered from Chris Cruz's vehicle belonged to Lynn Breeden. And now investigators had to reconstruct what happened between the last moments of Lynn's life and the discovery of her burned remains. The timeline mattered. Every hour mattered. Every person who had seen Lynn mattered. Because Lynn had not simply disappeared. She had entered a chain of events that ended with gunshots, gasoline, fire, and a dumpster. And somewhere inside that chain was the moment when a missing woman became a homicide victim. Lynn had been part of Vancouver's nightlife scene. She worked as a cocktail waitress. She was accustomed to late nights, unfamiliar faces, crowded rooms, and people whose lives existed almost entirely after sunset. That environment could make someone difficult to track. People came and went. Names were exchanged casually. Plans changed. Cars moved through the city. And when Lynn disappeared, there was initially no obvious reason to assume she had been murdered. A person could simply vanish from a nightlife environment. A phone could stop ringing. A friend could fail to return. A familiar face could suddenly be absent. But then the burned body was found. And everything changed. The investigation was no longer about finding a missing woman. It was about identifying a murdered woman and determining who had wanted her gone. The first challenge was the fire. Fire is destructive in a way that conventional crime scenes are not. It can alter the appearance of wounds, destroy fingerprints, consume clothing, damage bone. erased traces that might otherwise tell investigators exactly what happened. And whoever had burned Lynn's body appeared to have understood that. The location where the remains were discovered offered investigators very little. The dumpster was not a carefully preserved crime scene. It was a place where garbage was expected. A place where evidence could disappear beneath ordinary waste. A place where fire could make everything look like debris. But investigators did not stop. They collected what remained. They documented the fragments. They examined the skull. And they began the painstaking process of determining who the victim had been. The X-rays were critical. They revealed evidence of gunshot wounds. That discovery changed the nature of the investigation. Lynn had not simply died in a fire. The fire came after violence. The flames were not the beginning of the story. They were the attempted ending. Someone had apparently wanted the body destroyed after the killing. That meant investigators were looking for two things: a killer and someone who had tried to hide the killing. The two could be the same person, or the fire could have involved another individual. Either way, the destruction appeared deliberate. Then came the identification. Dental evidence helped establish that the remains were Lynn Breeden. The missing woman now had a face in the case file. Her family had an answer to the question that had been hanging over them. But an answer can also create a new nightmare. Because once investigators know who the victim is, they can begin asking who is closest to her. Who knew where she would be? Who knew where she lived? Who knew her routines? Who had access to her belongings? And who might have had something to gain from her disappearance? That investigation eventually brought Chris Cruz into sharper focus. Cruz had been associated with Lynn. He had been in her orbit around the time she disappeared. And evidence connected him to her possessions. That alone was suspicious. But investigators soon encountered another extraordinary development. A woman attempted to withdraw money from Lynn's bank account. The woman claimed to be Lynn. But Lynn was already dead. The bank teller stopped the transaction. The attempted withdrawal created a new question. Why would anyone possess Lynn's identification after her death? And who had provided it? Investigators identified the woman as Tanya Forrester. Her connection to Cruz became significant. According to investigators, Forrester had received Lynn's wallet and identification from Cruz. Cruz maintained that he had obtained the belongings from someone else. That explanation became part of the growing investigation. But detectives had more than statements. They had physical evidence. When police searched Cruz's vehicle, they found blood. That blood would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. At first, however, blood alone was not enough. Blood does not announce its owner. Investigators needed to establish whose blood it was. And the victim's burned remains seemed to make that almost impossible. Normally, forensic scientists might obtain DNA from blood, tissue, hair, saliva, or other biological material. But Lynn's body had been subjected to intense heat. Much of the biological material had been destroyed. The killer had created a forensic nightmare. Or so it seemed. The investigators could have treated the blood in the vehicle as suspicious. They could have presented the surrounding circumstances. They could have shown that Cruz possessed Lynn's belongings. They could have shown that another person attempted to access Lynn's bank account. They could have introduced the weapon and other objects recovered during the investigation. But the defense could still ask the most important question. Where is the proof that the blood belonged to Lynn? That question mattered. And it was precisely where forensic dentistry entered the story. Dr. David Sweet examined Lynn's remains. He knew that teeth could withstand conditions that destroyed other tissues. A tooth is not merely a hard shell. Inside it is a chamber containing pulp. The pulp can contain cells. Cells can contain DNA. And if enough of that DNA survived, it might be possible to create a genetic profile. The challenge was enormous. The remains had been burned. The material was degraded. The techniques available to forensic scientists in the early 1990s were nowhere near as advanced as the methods routinely used today. There were no modern consumer-style DNA databases. There was no effortless digital search. Every successful genetic comparison required careful laboratory work. Every usable marker mattered. And every fragment of surviving biological material had value. The tooth was opened. The pulp was recovered. The scientists began their work. Somewhere inside that material was a possibility. Either the DNA had survived, or it had not. If it had been destroyed, the investigation would have to rely heavily on other evidence. But if the DNA remained intact enough to analyze, it could answer the central question. Was the blood in Cruz's vehicle lens? The laboratory process moved forward. DNA was extracted from the tooth. The resulting profile was compared with the blood evidence recovered from Cruz's vehicle. Then came the result. The profiles matched. The blood was Lynn Breeden's. That one conclusion changed the evidentiary picture. It placed Lynn's blood inside Cruz's vehicle. Not somewhere on the street. Not in a random location. Inside the vehicle of a man already connected to Lynn and already connected to her belongings. The evidence now had a biological identity. And that identity was the woman whose burned body had been discovered after her disappearance. For investigators, the case was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But the scientific breakthrough did not answer every question. It did not automatically explain exactly what happened inside the vehicle. It did not reconstruct every minute. It did not reveal who fired the gun. It did not describe the final conversation between Lynn and Cruz. Science can identify. It can connect. It can exclude. But it cannot always tell an entire story. That story had to be built from many pieces. The blood was one piece. The gun was another. The gasoline container was another. The necklace and other property were additional pieces. The attempted bank withdrawal was another. The statements made by people connected to the case became additional pieces. And slowly, those fragments began forming a disturbing picture. Investigators believed Lynn had been killed and her body deliberately burned. Cruz became the central suspect. The case moved forward. But the courtroom would demand something more than suspicion. It would demand evidence strong enough to survive challenges. And Cruz's defense would have an obvious place to begin. The blood. What exactly did it prove? Could there be another explanation? Could the blood have been transferred? Could someone else have caused the injuries? Could Cruz have received Lynn's belongings without killing her? Every homicide case has a battle between two narratives. The prosecution attempts to show that the evidence forms a coherent sequence. The defense attempts to break that sequence apart. One unexplained gap can become an opening. One questionable assumption can become reasonable doubt. One piece of evidence can be challenged. But the prosecution had something unusual. A forensic link created from evidence that had almost been destroyed. The victim had been burned. Yet her DNA remained. And the DNA did not simply identify her. It connected her to the physical evidence recovered from Cruz's vehicle. The science became one of the defining elements of the case. It was a reminder that forensic evidence does not always have to be large to be powerful. Sometimes the most important clue is microscopic. A cell. A fragment. A drop of blood. A few milligrams of biological material hidden where fire could not reach. The investigation continued toward prosecution. And as the evidence accumulated, the story of Lynn Breeden became increasingly difficult to separate from the story of Chris Cruz. For Lynn's family, however, the scientific breakthrough could never restore what had been taken. DNA could identify the victim. It could help identify the killer. It could transform a mystery into a criminal case. But it could not undo the night Lynn disappeared. It could not return her to the people who loved her. It could not erase the image of the dumpster. It could not undo the fire. And it could not answer every private question left behind by a violent death. Who was the last person Lynn trusted? What did she believe was happening in the final minutes? Did she know she was in danger? Did she realize that the person beside her might become the person investigators would eventually accuse of her murder? Those questions would remain buried with her. But the evidence that survived would not. The fire had been intended to destroy the past. Instead, it preserved a clue in the most unlikely place imaginable. Inside a tooth. And when scientists extracted the DNA from that tiny surviving fragment, Lynn Breeden's identity came roaring back into the investigation. The victim could speak again. Not through words. Not through a surviving photograph. Not through a final message. Through DNA. A genetic signature that had survived heat, destruction, and time. And now the case was no longer simply about a woman who disappeared. It was about a chain of evidence pointing toward a man who would eventually stand before a court and answer for what had happened. The courtroom would have to decide what all those pieces meant. The blood. The belongings. The weapon. The gasoline. The attempted bank withdrawal. The burned body. And the tiny biological trace that connected the victim to Cruz's vehicle. The flames had nearly erased Lynn Breeden. But they had not erased the evidence. They had only made investigators search deeper for it. And the deeper they searched, the more remarkable the discovery became. Because the final clue had not been lying on the floor. It had not been hidden beneath a seat. It had not been recorded by a camera. It had been sealed inside the victim herself. Waiting. Silent. Invisible. Until science found a way to make it speak. By the time detectives understood what the blood meant, the investigation had already crossed into territory few homicide cases ever reach. They were no longer searching for a missing woman. They were no longer trying simply to identify a burned body. They were now assembling a case around a man whose own statements, movements, possessions, and vehicle appeared to place him dangerously close to the center of the crime. But the most important evidence had not been found in a witness statement. It had not been recovered from the dumpster. It had not been pulled from the ashes. It had been extracted from the inside of a tooth. And that discovery was about to change the meaning of everything detectives had collected. The blood inside Chris Cruz's vehicle was Lynn Breeden's blood. Blood had been found on the car. Blood had been found on clothing. Investigators had found blood and hair on a tire iron. There was a .22 caliber rifle. There was a large gasoline container. There were other objects that appeared connected to Lynn. But now the biological evidence gave those objects a connection to the victim herself. The question was no longer simply whether Cruz had known Lynn. He had. The question was no longer whether he had possessed items belonging to Lynn. He had. The question was no longer whether he had been in the same nightlife circles. He had. Now investigators had to determine what happened after the two of them left the after-hours club. That final journey became the dark center of the investigation. According to the reconstruction presented in the case, Lynn had spent the early morning hours at the after-hours nightclub. She was there with her boyfriend, Chris P. Cook. An argument developed after Lynn interacted with other men at the club. P. Cook eventually left. Lynn remained. She was reportedly looking for cocaine that night. And at some point, her path crossed with Chris Cruz. Cruz was not a stranger to that environment. He was a model and actor. He had attended the University of British Columbia and was reportedly planning to pursue medical school. He also used the name Tony Devins in connection with his work as a stripper and professional escort. On the surface, he was someone with a future. A university student. A young man with ambitions. someone who appeared to have several possible paths ahead of him. But investigators would come to believe that beneath that image was another life involving drugs, money, and a violent confrontation that ended with Lynn Breeden dead. The exact conversation between Lynn and Cruz was never recorded. There was no camera inside the car.
No surviving audio.
No independent witness who could describe every second. What investigators believed happened had to be reconstructed from the evidence. The two left the club after daybreak. At some point, an argument developed. Investigators believed the disagreement may have involved drugs and money. Then the situation escalated. A car became a crime scene. A tire iron became a weapon. And Lynn's blood entered the vehicle. The violence was severe. The medical examination later revealed evidence consistent with devastating injuries to Lynn's head. Bullet fragments were recovered from the skull, and investigators concluded that she had suffered gunshot wounds. The tire iron found in Cruz's vehicle added another disturbing element. It was not simply an object sitting among unrelated belongings. It carried blood and hair. And when investigators looked at the totality of the evidence, they believed Lynn had first been struck with a tire iron before being shot. But a forensic reconstruction can never replace the moment itself. The true final seconds belonged only to Lynn and the person who stood over her. That uncertainty is one of the cruelest features of homicide investigations. Investigators can recover evidence. They can reconstruct movement. They can establish timelines. They can determine that a weapon was present and that blood was transferred. But they cannot bring back the victim to explain what she saw. And Lynn was gone. After the killing, investigators believed the next stage was an attempt to eliminate the evidence. The body was placed in the trunk. The vehicle was moved. The remains were taken to a deserted area. And the body was placed inside a garbage dumpster. Then came the gasoline. The fire was devastating. It transformed a human body into charred remains and left investigators with almost none of the biological evidence they would normally expect. It was an act of destruction. But the killer had overlooked something. The human body is not equally vulnerable everywhere. The teeth can be remarkably resilient. And beneath the hard exterior of a tooth is tissue that can contain genetic information. That tiny protected material became the bridge between the victim and the evidence. Yet before investigators could use it, they first had to find the suspect. And that trail had already begun with something almost absurdly careless. Lynn's bank account. After Lynn disappeared, someone attempted to withdraw money from her account. The woman making the attempt was Tanya Forrester.
She was not Lynn.
The bank teller noticed. The attempt failed. But the security camera had captured an image. The image was not initially perfect. Sunlight and glare interfered with the photograph. A person could be seen outside. But investigators needed to know who that person was. Then photographic experts reprocessed the image. They reduced the glare. They enhanced the photograph. And the person outside the bank became visible enough for investigators to identify him. Chris Cruz. Suddenly, the bank attempt was no longer an isolated fraud. It was connected to the man already associated with Lynn's belongings.
Cruz was questioned.
And his explanation raised more questions. He acknowledged being out that night. He acknowledged being at nightlife venues. But he said he had left the after-hours club after only a short time. He claimed he had taken a taxi. He claimed he had gone to see a girlfriend. Then came the question about Lynn's purse. Why did he have it? Cruz reportedly said a friend had given him the contents and told him they had been stolen. That explanation created a strange chain of coincidence. Lynn had disappeared. Her belongings were now in Cruz's possession. A woman was trying to withdraw Lynn's money. The surveillance image appeared to show Cruz outside the bank. And Cruz had his own vehicle. When police asked about the car, his answer became even more significant. He described an older gray Oldsmobile, He said it was not running properly. He said it was at his grandmother's home in Surrey. But investigators already knew something Cruz apparently did not realize. They had been watching him. They knew he had driven the vehicle to police headquarters. He had parked it nearby. The car was not where he said it was. That discrepancy mattered. Because when investigators secured the vehicle and searched it, they found evidence that could potentially connect the car to Lynn.
Blood.
Objects. The tire iron. The rifle. The gasoline container. The jacket Cruz had reportedly worn at the after-hours club. And inside that jacket was a Playboy bunny pendant stained with blood. Lynn was known to wear a similar pendant. Each item added another layer. But detectives still faced the same enormous obstacle. What if the blood did not belong to Lynn? What if it belonged to someone else? Without a reference sample, the blood could be challenged. The case might look overwhelming and still collapse under the simplest question. Prove whose blood it is. That was why the tooth mattered so much. The DNA profile from the tooth pulp did not merely help identify Lynn. It provided the comparison sample investigators desperately needed. Scientists were able to compare the genetic profile from the surviving tissue with blood collected from Cruz's vehicle and other exhibits. The result was a match. The blood belonged to Lynn. The forensic evidence now connected the victim to the vehicle. The evidence connected Cruz to the vehicle. And the vehicle contained objects that investigators believed were associated with the killing. The chain was becoming difficult to break. But there was another question. What happened to the body after the killing? The answer appeared to be in the gasoline. Investigators believed Cruz had transported Lynn's body in the trunk and then disposed of it in the dumpster. The fire was intended to destroy the remains. And almost unbelievably, it nearly succeeded. The body had been reduced to approximately 35 pounds of charred remains. The destruction was so severe that investigators initially faced uncertainty even about the cause of death. Was the victim killed before the fire? Did the fire cause the fatal injuries? Was there another explanation? The skull eventually provided the answer. Fragments consistent with gunshot wounds remained. The fire had not erased everything. Again, the same pattern appeared. The killer destroyed evidence. But something survived. The skull survived enough to reveal the bullets. The teeth survived enough to help identify the victim. And the tooth pulp survived enough to produce DNA. 3 separate remnants. 3 pieces of information. 3 failures of the fire. That was the irony at the heart of the case. The destruction itself became evidence. The more investigators examined what remained, the more they understood that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the crime. Yet the attempt at destruction had not been complete. It had only changed the kind of investigation police had to conduct. The case was no longer a conventional homicide investigation. It was forensic archaeology. Investigators were working backward. From ashes to bone. From bone to teeth. From teeth to DNA. From DNA to blood. From blood to a vehicle. From the vehicle to a suspect. And from the suspect to the final hours of Lynn Breeden's life. The science had created the connection. Now the courtroom would have to decide what that connection meant. Cruz was charged with Lynn's murder. But the defense would not have the luxury of pretending there was only one piece of evidence. There were too many. The bank attempt. The surveillance image. The possession of Lynn's belongings. The statements about his movements. The vehicle. The blood. The tire iron. The rifle. The gasoline. The pendant. And the DNA. Individually, each piece could be questioned. Together, they formed a far more powerful narrative. And somewhere in that narrative was the image of a young woman leaving a nightclub in the early morning. She did not know that it would be the last time she would walk away from that place alive. She did not know that the man beside her would become the central figure in a murder investigation. She did not know that investigators would later reconstruct her final hours from fragments of evidence. And she could never have known that a tooth would become the silent witness that survived when almost every other witness was gone. The fire had been designed to destroy Lynn's story. Instead, it created one of the most remarkable forensic investigations of its era. Because the evidence did not disappear. It changed form. The blood became a genetic profile. The tooth became a biological archive. The burned skull became evidence of gunshots. The bank photograph became a connection. The vehicle became a container of clues. And the investigation became a race between destruction and science. The killer had chosen fire because fire destroys. But science had found something fire could not completely reach. And now, with the DNA comparison completed, the question hanging over Vancouver was no longer simply where Lynn Breeden had gone. It was what had happened to her. The answer was becoming unavoidable. And as prosecutors prepared to present the case, one final question remained. Would a jury believe that the collection of evidence proved Chris Cruz was responsible for Lynn's death? The answer would determine whether the remarkable DNA discovery became more than a scientific breakthrough. It would determine whether it became the evidence that sent a killer to prison. And for Lynn Breeden, whose life had been reduced to a handful of photographs, memories, and burned remains, the next stage of the case would finally put her name beside the word that investigators had been trying to prove from the beginning. Murder. The word was now official. Murder. Lynn Breeden had not simply vanished. She had not died by accident. She had been killed. And the evidence gathered by investigators was now moving toward a courtroom where every fragment recovered from the case would be placed under a different kind of fire. Cross-examination. The prosecution had the blood. The defense would have questions. The prosecution had Lynn's belongings. The defense would demand explanations. The prosecution had the surveillance image. The defense would challenge what the image actually proved. And behind all of it was the evidence that had changed the investigation forever. DNA recovered from a tooth. It was a remarkable scientific development. But science alone does not convict someone. A genetic match can establish identity. It can connect biological material to a person. It can demonstrate that blood found in a particular location belonged to the victim. But a courtroom must still determine what happened. How did Lynn's blood get inside the vehicle? Why were her belongings connected to Cruz? Why had another person attempted to access Lynn's bank account?
Why was a weapon found?
Why was gasoline found? Why had Lynn's body been burned? And why did so many separate pieces of evidence appear to converge on the same man? Those questions became central. The prosecution's case was not built around one spectacular clue. It was built around accumulation. One fact connected to another. One inconsistency created another question. One physical object supported another piece of testimony. And eventually, the evidence formed a chain. The chain began with Lynn. A woman who had been alive. A woman who had gone out. A woman who had expected to return. Then came the disappearance. Then the attempted bank withdrawal. Then the discovery of the body. Then the forensic examination. Then the vehicle. Then the blood. And finally, the DNA. Each step narrowed the distance between the victim and the person investigators believed was responsible. But there was still something deeply unsettling about the case. The most important evidence had come from a body that had almost been destroyed beyond recognition. The killer had apparently believed that fire would erase the past. Instead, the fire created a forensic puzzle that scientists were forced to solve. And solving that puzzle required patience. The remains had to be examined carefully. The teeth had to be studied. The dental evidence had to be compared. The surviving biological material had to be extracted. The genetic information had to be interpreted. Nothing about the process was instantaneous. There was no modern database producing a name in seconds. There was no computer screen flashing the identity of a suspect. There was a burned body, a laboratory, and scientists working with what little remained. That distinction matters. Because when people hear the word DNA today, they often imagine certainty arriving instantly. But in an investigation from the early 1990s, DNA evidence was still developing rapidly. The technology was powerful, but the methods required careful handling. The sample had to be sufficient. The profile had to be reliable. The comparison had to be meaningful. And the results had to survive scrutiny. In Lynn Breeden's case, the tooth became the unlikely source of that evidence. It had endured temperatures that destroyed most of the body. And inside it was biological material that could still reveal genetic information. That discovery had implications beyond this one case. It demonstrated that forensic scientists could sometimes recover DNA from severely burned human remains. It showed investigators that fire did not necessarily mean the complete destruction of genetic evidence. And it gave Lynn a scientific identity when the flames had nearly taken that away. But identification was only the beginning. The more difficult question was responsibility. Who had killed her? The prosecution believed the evidence pointed toward Chris Cruz. Cruz had been connected to Lynn. He had been in the same social environment. He had access to her belongings. He became connected to the attempted bank withdrawal. And his vehicle contained blood that DNA evidence identified as Lynn's. The circumstances surrounding the vehicle were particularly important. A car can preserve traces of human activity. Blood can remain in seams. Fibers can cling to fabric. Hair can become trapped. Objects can remain exactly where someone left them. And a vehicle can become a silent witness to events that happened inside it. That appeared to be what had happened here. The blood inside Cruz's vehicle told investigators that Lynn had been there and had bled there. The question became whether that blood was connected to the violence that killed her. The prosecution would argue that it was. The defense had to create an alternative explanation. But alternative explanations become increasingly difficult when multiple independent clues point in the same direction. The bank incident was one of those clues. Lynn was dead. Yet someone attempted to use her identity to obtain money. That person was connected to Cruz. The attempt failed. But it created a trail. And that trail led investigators back toward him. Then there were Lynn's possessions. The fact that her belongings were found in connection with Cruz gave detectives another reason to focus on him. The explanation that the items had been obtained from another person had to be evaluated against everything else investigators knew. A single questionable possession might have been innocent. But possession combined with blood was different. Blood combined with a victim's belongings was different again. And blood, belongings, a weapon, gasoline, a surveillance image, and conflicting accounts created an increasingly difficult pattern to dismiss. The prosecution did not need the fire to tell the entire story. The fire had already destroyed too much. Instead, investigators reconstructed the story from what survived. That became the defining characteristic of the case. What survived? A tooth survived. DNA survived. Blood survived. Bone survived. Objects survived. Memories survived. And the contradictions in the suspect's story survived. The killer had attempted to erase the physical evidence. But the investigation was not limited to the physical evidence. People remembered. Records remained. Financial transactions remained. Vehicles remained. And forensic science connected the pieces. The courtroom therefore became a place where the past was reconstructed without Lynn herself being there to describe it. That is one of the most difficult realities of homicide trials. The victim cannot testify. Someone else must speak for the evidence. A medical examiner explains the injuries. A forensic scientist explains the DNA. A detective explains the investigation. A witness explains what they saw. A bank employee explains the attempted withdrawal. And the physical evidence sits silently before the jury. The jury must then reconstruct the crime from all of those fragments. In Lynn's case, the central question was whether those fragments formed a complete enough picture to establish Cruz's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution presented its theory. Lynn was killed. Her body was burned. Her possessions became part of a trail leading toward Cruz. Her blood was found in his vehicle. DNA established that the blood was hers. The circumstances surrounding the vehicle and the other evidence strengthened the connection. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation. That is what a trial is supposed to do. Evidence is tested. Witnesses are questioned. Assumptions are challenged. The jury listens. And slowly, the abstract case becomes a human story. There was Lynn, 30 years old, working, living, making plans. A person whose future had once seemed ordinary. Then there was the final night, the nightclub, the people around her, the movement through Vancouver, the encounter with Cruz, the violence, the disappearance, the fire, the dumpster. And then the investigation. Every homicide eventually becomes a timeline. A sequence of moments. At one point, Lynn was alive. At another, she was not. Somewhere between those 2 points was the crime. The prosecution had to convince the jury that the evidence placed Cruz on the wrong side of that line. The DNA was crucial because it was difficult to explain away. Lynn's blood was not an abstract laboratory sample. It was evidence recovered from the suspect's vehicle. And the genetic profile from the burned remains provided the scientific connection. That is why the tooth mattered. Without it, investigators might still have had a compelling case. But with it, they had something different. They had a biological link. A link that could be explained scientifically. A link that did not depend upon a witness remembering a conversation years later. A link that did not depend upon someone's interpretation of a photograph. A link written into human biology. The fire had destroyed Lynn's face. It had destroyed much of her body. But it had not destroyed the genetic information locked inside the tooth. And that tiny piece of surviving evidence helped transform the investigation. The case was now about more than suspicion. It was about evidence that could be examined, measured, and explained. The jury would eventually hear the competing arguments. They would be asked to look beyond the horror of the burned remains, beyond the sensational details, beyond the emotional impact of a young woman being murdered. They would have to decide whether the evidence proved the case. That distinction was critical. A murder trial is not a contest over who seems most suspicious. It is a test of evidence. And the evidence against Cruz was extensive. The prosecution presented its reconstruction. The defense offered its challenges. The jury listened. Then the deliberation began. For Lynn's family, years of uncertainty had already been replaced by something worse.
Certainty.
They knew Lynn was dead. They knew she had been murdered. Now they needed the justice system to determine who was responsible. That process could never return Lynn. Nothing could. But a conviction could establish accountability. It could place a legal conclusion at the end of a terrible sequence of events. And eventually, the jury reached its decision. Chris Cruz was found guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment, with parole eligibility after a specified period under Canadian law. The case that had begun with a nameless burned body had reached a courtroom verdict. The woman in the dumpster had a name again. Lynn Breeden. The body had been identified. The evidence had been connected. The suspect had been prosecuted. And the jury had delivered its conclusion. But the story did not end with a verdict. Because the most haunting part of the case was not simply that a woman had been murdered. It was how close the truth had come to disappearing. Imagine if the tooth had been destroyed. Imagine if the blood had been too degraded. Imagine if the bank attempt had never been noticed. Imagine if the surveillance image had remained hidden behind glare. Imagine if investigators had accepted the first explanation and stopped looking. The case might have taken a very different path. That is the uncomfortable truth about cold investigations. Sometimes justice depends on a single fragment surviving, a single witness remembering, a single photograph being recovered, a single scientist asking one more question. In Lynn Breeden's case, that question was whether the burned remains still contained usable DNA. The answer was yes. And that answer changed everything. The killer had relied on destruction. Investigators relied on persistence. The fire had been temporary. DNA was permanent enough to survive. And that is why, decades later, the forensic story of Lynn Breeden remains so striking. The most devastating evidence in the case was not the burned body. It was the evidence that remained after the body had been burned. The tooth. The blood. The genetic connection. A microscopic record that refused to disappear. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. A crime scene can be burned. A vehicle can be cleaned. A story can be changed. A memory can fade. But sometimes the smallest trace refuses to cooperate with the lie. Sometimes it survives. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes, years after the crime, a scientist opens what appears to be nothing more than a damaged tooth and discovers that the victim has left behind one final statement. Not a voice. Not a confession. Not a name. Just DNA. Enough to tell investigators that Lynn Breeden had been there. Enough to connect her blood to the evidence. Enough to help turn a devastating mystery into a murder prosecution. And enough to ensure that the fire did not get the final word. The verdict did not erase the questions. It answered the legal question of responsibility, but the human questions remained. What happened to Lynn in the final hours of her life? What did she see? What did she hear? Did she understand that the situation had become dangerous? Did she realize that the night she had expected to end like any other night would become the last night of her life? Those questions cannot be answered by a DNA profile. DNA can identify. It can connect. It can exclude. It can survive when flesh is gone. But it cannot tell a victim's final thoughts. That silence is permanent. For Lynn's family, the verdict brought a form of justice, but justice and closure are not the same thing. Closure suggests an ending, a clean line, a final page. Homicide rarely provides that. Instead, there are fragments, photographs, court records, evidence bags, names, dates, and memories that become sharper precisely because the person they belong to is no longer there. Lynn Breeden became one of those names. A woman whose life was reduced to evidence after her death. A woman remembered through the investigation that followed her disappearance. But before she became a victim in a case file, she had been a person moving through Vancouver. She had friends, relationships,
plans, a job,
a personality, a routine. She had the ordinary details that make a life real. Those details can disappear from a homicide investigation because investigators naturally focus on the final hours. Where was she? Who was with her? What happened? Where was the body? What evidence survived? But the final hours were not Lynn's entire life. They were only the last chapter. And that distinction matters. Because violent crime has a way of rewriting a victim's identity. The public remembers the crime. The headlines remember the murder. The courtroom remembers the evidence. But the people who knew Lynn remember the woman who existed before the crime. That is the part no forensic test can reconstruct. The investigation, however, had another legacy. The case demonstrated how forensic science could succeed even when conventional evidence appeared hopelessly compromised. The remains had been subjected to fire. Investigators could not simply rely on recognizable features. They had to work with what survived.
Bone. Teeth.
Dental structures. Fragments. And eventually DNA. The scientific breakthrough was especially important because of the condition of the remains. Fire creates an illusion of total destruction. It makes investigators believe that everything has been reduced to nothing. But that is not always true. Human remains contain structures that can resist heat differently. Teeth are among the strongest. The enamel is extraordinarily hard. The interior can remain protected. And in the right circumstances, the pulp can preserve biological information. That meant the killer's attempt to erase Lynn's identity was incomplete. The body had been burned. But Lynn's genetic identity remained. That identity became the foundation for the comparison. The blood recovered from the vehicle could now be understood in context. It was not simply blood. It was Lynn's blood. And that distinction transformed the evidence. Imagine the investigation before the result. Detectives have a burned body. They suspect the victim is Lynn. They have a suspect. They have Lynn's belongings. They have suspicious circumstances. They recover blood. But the defense could ask whether the blood actually came from Lynn. Then the tooth speaks. The DNA profile provides the answer.
Yes.
The blood belonged to Lynn. A tiny biological fact suddenly carries the weight of an entire investigation. That is the strange power of forensic evidence. Its physical size can be almost meaningless compared with its significance. A drop of blood can be smaller than a fingernail. A tooth can fit inside a hand. A strand of hair can be nearly invisible. Yet these fragments can connect people to places and events with a precision that eyewitness memory sometimes cannot match. And in Lynn's case, the tooth became one of the most important surviving witnesses. It had no memory, no voice,
No intention.
but it carried information. Information the fire could not destroy. The investigation also demonstrated another reality of homicide work. Evidence rarely exists alone. A single clue may be ambiguous. A single photograph may be unclear. A single statement may have an innocent explanation. A single object may mean nothing. But when separate clues begin pointing toward the same conclusion, the pattern changes. Investigators examine that pattern. Prosecutors present it. Defense attorneys challenge it. And jurors decide whether the pattern is strong enough to meet the legal standard. In Lynn's case, the pattern included the relationship between Lynn and Cruz. It included the possession of her property. It included the attempted use of her identity. It included the surveillance evidence. It included the vehicle. It included the blood. It included the forensic findings from the remains. And it included the circumstances surrounding the disposal and burning of Lynn's body. The DNA did not exist in isolation. That is important. It became powerful because it fit into a much larger evidentiary picture. The blood placed Lynn inside the vehicle. Other evidence helped establish the circumstances. The burned remains established the devastating outcome. The investigation connected the pieces. And eventually, the legal system reached its conclusion. But for forensic scientists, the case represented something beyond a conviction. It represented possibility. If DNA could be recovered from severely burned remains, then future investigators could approach similar cases differently. A burned body would not necessarily mean a body without answers. A fire would not necessarily mean the end of biological evidence. The lesson was simple. Look deeper. Do not assume destruction means absence. Do not discard a possible source because it appears damaged. Examine the teeth. Examine the bone. Examine what survived. Because sometimes the most important evidence is hidden inside something that looks useless. That principle has become increasingly important as forensic technology has developed. Modern investigators now have techniques that were unavailable or far less sophisticated when Lynn's case was investigated. DNA analysis has become faster and more sensitive. Laboratories can work with smaller and more degraded samples. Databases can help identify unknown individuals. Advanced imaging can reveal information hidden inside damaged remains. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Evidence has to survive somewhere, and investigators have to find it. In Lynn's case, they found it inside a tooth. The irony is difficult to ignore. The killer apparently used fire because fire destroys. Yet the fire may have unintentionally preserved the clue that became essential to the investigation. The flames consumed what could be seen, but they did not consume what could be analyzed. That difference became everything. There is another disturbing dimension to the case. The body was not simply abandoned. It was burned. That suggests an effort to conceal the crime. Someone had to make the decision to use gasoline. Someone had to transport the remains. Someone had to place them where they were eventually discovered. Every one of those actions created risk. Every movement created another opportunity for evidence to appear. And every attempt to hide one clue potentially created another. This is one of the paradoxes of criminal investigation. The more elaborate the attempt to conceal a crime, the more actions a suspect may have to take. And every action can leave a trace. A purchase. A vehicle. A witness. A photograph. A statement. A transaction. A biological sample. The killer may think concealment is reducing the evidence.
Sometimes it is multiplying it.
Lynn's case contained that paradox repeatedly. The fire destroyed the body. But the attempt to destroy the body created a scene that investigators had to explain. The victim's possessions were moved. That movement created another trail. The bank account was targeted. That created a financial record. The vehicle was used. That created a crime scene. And the violence itself left biological evidence. The killer could not control all of those systems. No one can.
A person can control what they say.
They cannot control what DNA reveals. They can move a body. They cannot guarantee that every trace will disappear. They can tell investigators one story, but a laboratory can tell another. And when those stories conflict, investigators listen carefully to the evidence. That is what happened here. The case became a confrontation between human explanation and physical evidence. And physical evidence does not negotiate. It does not become nervous. It does not forget. It does not change its story because the years have passed. DNA remains DNA. Blood remains blood. A tooth remains a record. That is why the scientific discovery was so important. It gave Lynn something that many murder victims never receive. A voice after death. Not a literal voice, but an evidentiary one. A biological statement that could be tested.
Compared.
Explained. And presented in court. The fire had tried to make Lynn anonymous. The investigation gave her name back. The evidence gave her identity back. And the courtroom gave the case a legal conclusion. Yet, even after the verdict, one image remained impossible to forget. A dumpster. A fire.
A burned body.
And somewhere within those remains, a tooth that had survived. the smallest survivor in a case built around destruction. That tooth had no idea what it would become. It was simply part of Lynn. But after her death, it became something else. A clue. A source of DNA. A scientific link. A piece of evidence that helped investigators reconstruct the truth. And perhaps that is why the case continues to feel so unsettling. Because the most powerful witness was not a person standing outside the crime scene. It was a fragment of the victim herself. Lynn could not walk into a courtroom. She could not identify her killer. She could not describe the final hours. She could not tell detectives where she had been. But something of her remained. And when investigators looked closely enough, that fragment spoke. The fire had not erased Lynn. It had only hidden her evidence. And, eventually, science found it. The evidence had spoken, but evidence always leaves behind another question. What happens after the science is accepted? What happens when a burned body becomes a named victim, when a suspect becomes an accused murderer, and when a courtroom must decide whether a collection of fragments is enough to reconstruct a death? For Lynn Breeden, that process was not abstract. Every piece of evidence represented something that had happened to a real person. The blood inside the vehicle represented violence. The damaged skull represented gunshots. The burned remains represented an attempt to conceal the crime. The belongings represented a life interrupted. And the tooth represented the part of Lynn that refused to disappear. But investigators still had to explain the sequence. The sequence was everything. A jury could not simply be told that a tooth produced DNA and that the DNA matched blood from a vehicle. They had to understand why that fact mattered. They had to understand how the evidence fit together. And they had to decide whether the entire chain pointed toward one conclusion. The prosecution's theory was that Lynn had been killed after leaving the nightclub environment and that her body had later been transported and burned. The vehicle became central to that theory. Inside it were traces that investigators believed were connected to the crime. The blood was especially important. Blood does not simply appear without an event. Someone had been injured. Someone had bled. And DNA established that the blood belonged to Lynn. That meant Lynn had been inside the vehicle at some point. The question was whether that presence was innocent. The circumstances suggested otherwise. Lynn was dead. Her body had been burned. She had suffered fatal violence. And the man connected to the vehicle was already connected to Lynn through the events surrounding her disappearance. The evidence did not need to tell investigators that Lynn had once been inside the car. The DNA had already done that. What investigators needed to determine was what happened there. That was where the other evidence mattered. The tire iron. The blood. The hair. The rifle. The gasoline. Each object became another piece in the reconstruction. A tire iron by itself is an ordinary object. Millions of people own one. A rifle by itself does not prove murder. A gasoline container does not prove homicide. A jacket does not prove anything. But evidence is rarely interpreted in isolation. The question is not simply, what is this object? The question is, why is this object here, and how does it relate to everything else? That was the question investigators kept asking. Why was Lynn's blood in the vehicle? Why were objects associated with Lynn found in connection with Cruz? Why was a woman attempting to access Lynn's bank account? Why did the surveillance evidence place Cruz near the attempted withdrawal? Why did the vehicle contain items that investigators considered significant? And why had Lynn's body been burned? One explanation might be coincidence. Several explanations require more coincidence. Eventually, the number of coincidences becomes part of the evidence itself. That was the challenge facing the defense. It was not enough to say that individual pieces of evidence could have innocent explanations. The defense had to convince the jury that the entire pattern could reasonably be explained another way. That is often the hardest task in a circumstantial case. Because a circumstantial case does not necessarily depend upon one person saying, "I saw him do it." Instead, it asks the jury to look at the totality of the evidence. A person disappears. A body is found. The body is identified. The suspect has the victim's property. The suspect's vehicle contains the victim's blood. A scientific test confirms the blood. A weapon and other suspicious objects are recovered. A financial transaction involving the victim's identity is attempted. And the suspect's account of events becomes part of the investigation. The jury must then determine whether all of those events fit together naturally, or whether they require a different explanation. For Lynn's family, none of this changed the most important fact. She was gone. The legal system could determine responsibility. Science could determine identity. But neither could restore the future that had been taken from her. That future had disappeared with her. There would be no more birthdays. No more ordinary arguments. No more late-night conversations. No more plans. No chance to grow older. A homicide case can reduce all of those possibilities to a single date. The date of death. But a person is more than the date of death. That was why identifying Lynn mattered so much. The investigators were not simply trying to identify an unknown body. They were trying to restore a name to someone who had been deliberately stripped of one. The fire had made the remains anonymous. The dental examination helped restore identity. The DNA provided additional confirmation. And once Lynn had been identified, the investigation could move forward with a victim rather than a mystery. That difference changed everything. Detectives could now investigate her relationships, her workplace, her movements, her social connections, her final known whereabouts, the people who had seen her, the people who had spoken to her, and the person who would eventually become the focus of the prosecution. Every homicide has a moment when the investigation changes direction. For Lynn, one of those moments was the discovery of her belongings. Another was the attempted bank withdrawal. Another was the search of the vehicle. But the DNA result was different. It was scientific. It was independent. It gave investigators something that could be explained without relying entirely on human memory. The blood belonged to Lynn. That fact became a foundation. And from that foundation, investigators could construct the rest of the case. The forensic evidence also demonstrated how difficult it is to completely destroy a crime scene. A fire can destroy visible evidence, but it cannot necessarily erase microscopic evidence. A person can burn clothing, but DNA may remain elsewhere. A person can move a body, but blood may remain inside a vehicle. A person can discard belongings, but someone may find them. A person can lie about a car, but investigators may already know where it was. Every attempt at concealment carries risk. And the longer the chain of concealment becomes, the more opportunities investigators have to find a break. That appears to have happened in Lynn's case. The attempt to conceal the body did not conceal the investigation. It created another layer of questions. Why was gasoline involved? Why was the body placed where it was? Why was the victim's identity being used after her death? Why were her possessions circulating among people connected to the investigation? And why did the physical evidence repeatedly point back toward Cruz? These questions became part of the courtroom narrative. But there was something else happening outside the courtroom. The case was becoming a lesson in forensic science. The discovery that DNA could be recovered from the pulp of a burned tooth was extraordinary. At the time, the idea was still relatively novel. The investigators were dealing with a victim whose remains had been severely compromised. Conventional methods were limited. Yet the tooth provided a pathway. The interior of the tooth had offered protection. The biological material inside it retained enough information for scientific analysis. The significance went beyond Lynn. Future investigators would have another reason to examine burned remains carefully. They would know that destruction was not necessarily total. They would understand that teeth could preserve valuable evidence. And they would recognize that even when a body appears almost completely destroyed, there may still be biological material capable of answering critical questions. In that sense, Lynn's case became part of the evolution of forensic investigation. The crime was tragic. The investigation was disturbing. But the scientific discovery was important. It showed what could happen when investigators refused to accept that the fire had erased everything. That refusal mattered. Because the easiest conclusion would have been to assume that the remains were too damaged. The harder conclusion was to keep searching, to examine another tooth, to ask whether something might remain inside, to send the material to a laboratory, to wait for the result. That process required persistence. And persistence is often what separates an unsolved mystery from a solved case. Not every investigation receives a perfect clue. Not every victim leaves behind usable DNA. Not every suspect makes mistakes. But investigators can continue asking questions. They can test assumptions. They can revisit evidence. They can use new science to examine old mysteries. Lynn's case demonstrated exactly why that matters. The evidence was not spectacular. It was tiny. The tooth itself could fit in the palm of a hand. The biological material inside, it was microscopic. But its significance was enormous. It connected a burned victim to blood recovered from a suspect's vehicle. And it helped transform a horrifying discovery into a prosecutable homicide case. The fire had attempted to create uncertainty. The DNA created certainty about one critical fact. The blood was Lynn's. That did not answer every question, but it answered enough to move the investigation forward. And as the case proceeded, the name Lynn Breeden became permanently connected with a story that would be remembered not only for its violence, but for the forensic breakthrough that followed. The victim whose body had been burned became the center of a scientific investigation. The tooth that survived became evidence. The evidence became testimony. The testimony became part of a prosecution. And the prosecution eventually became a conviction. Yet beneath all of those legal and scientific developments was the same unsettling reality. Someone had tried to make Lynn disappear. Not just physically. Completely. To destroy the body. To obscure the identity. To eliminate the evidence. To leave behind confusion. But the attempt failed. The body was found. The identity was established. The evidence was recovered. The blood was tested. The DNA was matched. And the suspect was prosecuted. That is the part of the story that makes the case so difficult to forget. The smallest surviving fragment became stronger than the fire. The fire was dramatic. The tooth was silent. The flames were visible. The DNA was invisible. But when the investigation reached the courtroom, it was the invisible evidence that helped tell the story. And that is the strange power of forensic science. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to shout. Sometimes it only needs to survive. Lynn's tooth survived. Her DNA survived. And because it survived, investigators could establish a connection that the fire was never supposed to leave behind. The flames had consumed almost everything. But almost everything was not everything. And in a homicide investigation, that difference can be the difference between a mystery and an answer. There is a point in every murder investigation when the evidence stops being a collection of objects and begins to become a story. A tire iron is no longer just a tire iron. A bloodstain is no longer just a stain. A bank transaction is no longer just a failed attempt to withdraw money. A burned tooth is no longer simply part of human remains. Each becomes a sentence. Each answers one question while creating another. And in the case of Lynn Breeden, investigators were now reading those sentences together. The story they formed was devastating. Lynn had entered the final hours of her life, surrounded by the ordinary chaos of Vancouver nightlife. Then something changed. A disagreement. A confrontation. A violent encounter. And after that, an attempt to erase what had happened. The fire was supposed to end the investigation before it began. Instead, it became the beginning of one of the most remarkable forensic examinations in the case. The first task was to establish the victim's identity. That alone was not simple. The remains had been burned so severely that visual identification was impossible. There was no ordinary photograph to compare. No recognizable face. No intact body. Investigators had to depend upon the structures that remained. Dental characteristics became important. The teeth had survived better than the surrounding tissue. The jaw provided information. And gradually, the unknown woman became Lynn Breeden. Once the name was established, investigators could reconstruct the disappearance. The missing person report was no longer an isolated event. It was connected to the burned body. The timeline tightened. Lynn had been alive. Then she disappeared. Then her remains were found. And between those moments was a crime. The investigation moved backward from the body toward Lynn's final known movements. That process brought investigators toward the people she had been with. It brought them toward the nightclub. It brought them toward the social circle surrounding her. And eventually it brought them toward Chris Cruz. Cruz's connection to Lynn became increasingly significant. He had been around the same nightlife environment. He had contact with Lynn. And investigators discovered that he had access to her possessions. Then came the attempted bank withdrawal. That event might sound almost ordinary if the victim had been alive. A person walks into a bank. A person presents identification. A person requests money. But Lynn was dead. The woman attempting the transaction was not Lynn. And the identification she carried belonged to the murdered woman. That was no longer an ordinary financial event. It was evidence. The woman was identified as Tanya Forrester. She became another link in the chain. Investigators learned that Lynn's wallet and identification had come from Cruz. Now the question was why. Cruz's explanation was that the belongings had come to him through someone else. That explanation had to be measured against the rest of the evidence. Then investigators examined Cruz's vehicle. The search produced blood. And the blood would become one of the most important clues in the case. But again, investigators faced a problem. Blood without identification can be ambiguous. The crucial question was whose blood? The answer could not be obtained from a simple visual examination. The victim's body had been burned. Traditional biological evidence had been severely damaged. The obvious sources were gone. So scientists looked somewhere less obvious. The teeth. The tooth was not just a piece of bone-like material. Inside it was pulp. And inside the pulp could be genetic material. The laboratory work became a race against degradation. The scientists needed to recover DNA from a body that had been subjected to intense heat. They needed enough genetic information to establish a reliable profile. And then they needed to compare that profile with the blood recovered from the vehicle. The result was crucial. The DNA from the tooth provided a profile consistent with Lynn Breeden. The blood from Cruz's vehicle matched that profile. A connection that had once been impossible to establish was now supported by forensic science. Lynn's blood had been inside the vehicle. The vehicle was associated with Cruz. And suddenly, an object that could have been dismissed as suspicious became part of a biological chain. This was the moment when the investigation gained scientific weight. But it was not the only evidence. The vehicle contained other items investigators considered significant. A tire iron. Blood. Hair. A firearm. A gasoline container. clothing, a necklace or pendant resembling jewelry associated with Lynn. These objects did not independently tell the whole story, but together, they created a disturbing picture. The prosecution would eventually argue that the evidence demonstrated that Lynn had been attacked, killed, transported, and burned. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge those conclusions. But the physical evidence remained. And physical evidence is often difficult to persuade. It is not remembered differently because time passes. It does not change because a suspect changes his story. It does not become emotional when a jury hears the details. It simply exists. The forensic scientists could explain the DNA. The investigators could explain where the blood had been found. The medical evidence could explain the injuries. And the jury could decide what all of it meant. Yet there was another issue that made the case particularly disturbing: the attempted destruction of the body. Why burn the remains? Because whoever did it apparently wanted the body to become unidentifiable. That was the purpose of the fire. Destroy the face. Destroy the tissue. Destroy the evidence. Make identification difficult. Make the investigation slow. Create uncertainty. But the plan had a weakness. It depended on the assumption that destruction would be complete. It wasn't. A tooth survived. The skull retained critical information. The blood survived inside the vehicle. And Lynn's possessions survived outside her body. The fire could not control all of those things. That is an important lesson in forensic investigation. A crime is not confined to the place where the victim is found. Evidence travels. Blood can travel. Objects can travel. People travel. Money travels. Vehicles travel. Stories travel. And every movement creates another potential source of evidence. The body was moved. The vehicle moved. The belongings moved. Money was targeted. The suspect moved through the city. Each movement left another opportunity for investigators to reconstruct what happened. The killer may have controlled the fire, but the killer could not control the entire world around it. That became the investigator's advantage. The bank teller could not have known that a failed transaction would become evidence. The surveillance camera could not have known that its image would become important. The tooth could not have known that its DNA would connect blood to a victim. But all of those things existed, and investigators kept following them. The case therefore became a demonstration of how homicide investigations are often solved. Not through one brilliant detective, not through one dramatic confession, but through persistence. A detective asks one question. A laboratory answers another. A witness remembers something. A bank preserves a record. A camera preserves an image. A forensic scientist examines a fragment. One clue creates the next. And eventually, the distance between victim and suspect becomes smaller and smaller. For Lynn, that distance became almost impossible to ignore. Her belongings were connected to Cruz. Her blood was found in his vehicle. Her DNA was recovered from burned remains. The circumstances of the attempted bank withdrawal connected people around Cruz to Lynn's identity. The other physical evidence strengthened the prosecution's reconstruction. The case had become a web, and Cruz was at its center. Yet the most haunting question remained unanswered. Why Lynn? What caused the confrontation? What transformed an ordinary night into murder? The investigation could establish many facts. But motive is often the most elusive element. People assume murder always has a simple reason: money, jealousy, revenge,
fear, drugs,
anger. But human behavior rarely fits neatly into one category. A confrontation can escalate faster than anyone expects. A person can make one decision and then another. And within minutes, A situation can pass a point of no return. The final moments of Lynn's life may have contained that transition. The moment when an argument became violence. The moment when violence became murder. The moment when someone realized there was a body to dispose of. And then the moment when gasoline was poured and fire was introduced. Every stage represented another decision. Another opportunity to stop. Another opportunity to seek help. Instead, the evidence indicated concealment. And concealment created more evidence. The tragedy was irreversible. But the investigation was not. The detectives continued. The laboratory continued. The prosecution continued. And eventually the case reached the jury. The jury heard the evidence. They heard the competing explanations. They saw the photographs. They heard about the blood. They heard about the DNA. They heard about the burned remains. They heard about the attempted bank withdrawal. They heard about the objects recovered from the vehicle. And they had to decide whether the evidence met the legal standard for conviction. When they returned with their verdict, the investigation reached its legal conclusion. Chris Cruz was convicted of second-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment. The legal system had reached its judgment. But the scientific story of the case remained. Because the most extraordinary part of the investigation was not the verdict. It was how the evidence had survived long enough to make the verdict possible. The fire had nearly succeeded. That is worth remembering. The remains were severely damaged. Identification was difficult. Conventional biological evidence had been compromised. A less persistent investigation might have stopped. A less innovative forensic approach might have missed the tooth. And without the tooth, the blood evidence might never have had the same scientific meaning. But investigators kept looking. Scientists kept testing. And the tooth produced DNA. That is why this case belongs in the history of forensic science. Not because DNA solved every mystery. It did not. Not because every question received an answer. It did not. But because a tiny biological sample demonstrated something fundamental. Evidence can survive where people least expect it. A body can burn. A memory can fade. A witness can disappear. A suspect can deny. But genetic information can remain locked inside microscopic structures, waiting for the right technology and the right question. Lynn's tooth became that silent archive. It carried a biological record through the fire. And when scientists finally opened that record, it helped connect the victim to the evidence. The killer had attempted to destroy the story. Instead, the destruction became part of the story. The flames became evidence of concealment. The burned remains became evidence of homicide. The tooth became evidence of identity. The blood became evidence of connection. And the investigation transformed all of those fragments into a narrative that could be presented in court. That is what makes the case so difficult to forget. Not simply the violence. Not simply the fire. But the fact that after almost everything visible had been destroyed, something invisible remained. DNA. A genetic signature. A trace that did not care about the fire. Did not care about the darkness. Did not care about the years. It simply waited. And when investigators found it, Lynn Breeden was no longer just a burned body in a dumpster. She was a woman whose final evidence had survived. And that evidence helped ensure that the person convicted of her murder could not make the fire the final chapter of her story. The flames had the last word at the crime scene. But they did not have the last word in the investigation. The most important discoveries in a homicide investigation are not always made at the beginning. Sometimes the truth arrives slowly. A fragment here. A contradiction there. A laboratory result that changes the meaning of evidence collected weeks earlier. A photograph that becomes clearer. A statement that suddenly no longer fits. And sometimes, Years before forensic technology becomes commonplace, one small discovery proves that the evidence was never truly gone. That was the significance of Lynn Breeden's tooth. At first glance, it was simply part of a burned body. But investigators understood that teeth could survive conditions that destroyed almost everything around them. The enamel was hard. The structure was dense. The interior could be protected. And inside that interior was pulp. Inside the pulp was the possibility of DNA. The scientific process turned that possibility into evidence. And once the genetic profile was obtained, investigators had something they could compare with the blood found in Cruz's vehicle. The match became a critical piece of the case. But the importance of the result goes beyond the word match. It demonstrated that the fire had failed to erase Lynn's biological identity. That failure mattered because the fire appeared to have been deliberate. The body had been burned after the killing. The purpose, investigators believed, was concealment. The victim could become difficult to identify. The injuries could become difficult to interpret. The body could become evidence that had been destroyed rather than preserved. But fire does not destroy all evidence equally. And the investigators understood that. They examined the remains carefully. They looked at the bones. They examined the teeth. They used radiography. They considered what the damage could tell them. The skull contained information that the flames had not erased. There were fractures. There were bullet fragments. The evidence pointed toward gunshot injuries. Now the investigators knew they were not dealing with an unexplained death. The woman had been violently killed. Then someone had attempted to destroy her remains. That sequence was critical. Death first. Fire afterward. The fire was not the cause of the entire story. It was part of the concealment. And once investigators understood that, the search for the killer became more focused. The question was not simply who had access to Lynn. It was who had been connected to her final movements and the subsequent destruction of her body. That trail repeatedly returned to Cruz. His connection to Lynn was already established. His possession of her belongings was significant. The attempted bank withdrawal was significant. The surveillance evidence was significant. His vehicle was significant. And the blood inside that vehicle was now scientifically identified. Lynn's blood. That was a major turning point. Because a vehicle can be explained away. A relationship can be explained away. A possession can be explained away. A photograph can be challenged. But when multiple forms of evidence converge, the explanation becomes increasingly difficult. The investigation had become a process of elimination. Who else could explain the evidence? Who else had the opportunity? Who else was connected to the victim? Who else had access to the vehicle? Who else had a reason to possess Lynn's belongings? Every answer narrowed the field. And eventually, the prosecution's case centered on Cruz. But the courtroom was not simply about reconstructing events. It was about proving them. The prosecution had to explain the evidence clearly. The defense had to challenge it. The jury had to decide. That process can be difficult for any homicide case. For this one, the emotional impact was especially severe. The jury was being asked to examine the remains of a woman whose body had been deliberately burned. They were being asked to hear how investigators had identified her. They were being asked to hear about the DNA. They were being asked to hear about the blood. And they were being asked to determine whether Cruz was responsible. The prosecution's theory was straightforward in its broad outline. Lynn was killed. Her body was transported. Her body was burned. Her belongings were connected to Cruz. Her blood was found in Cruz's vehicle. The DNA confirmed the blood belonged to Lynn. The other physical evidence strengthened the connection. The defense could challenge individual elements. But the jury had to consider the entire picture. That is where circumstantial evidence becomes powerful. People sometimes use the term circumstantial as though it means weak. It does not. Circumstantial evidence can be extraordinarily powerful when independent facts point in the same direction. If a person is found holding a victim's property, that alone may not prove murder. If blood is found in a vehicle, that alone may not prove murder. If a person lies about where a vehicle was located, that alone may not prove murder. But if all of those things occur in the same investigation, the combined meaning becomes much more significant. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's case. Cruz was convicted of second-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment. The legal process had reached its conclusion. But the scientific importance of the case remained. The discovery that usable DNA could be obtained from burned tooth pulp demonstrated the potential of forensic dentistry in circumstances where conventional DNA sources were unavailable. It was not merely a clever laboratory trick. It represented a different way of thinking. Instead of asking, "What evidence did the fire destroy?" investigators could ask, "What evidence did the fire fail to destroy?" That is a completely different question. And sometimes the second question is the one that solves the case. The distinction is important in forensic work. Destruction is rarely absolute. Even a catastrophic event leaves gradients. Some areas receive more heat. Some receive less. Some materials burn. Some char. Some survive. Some biological structures are protected by surrounding tissue. Some are protected by their own physical properties. The investigator's job is to find those differences. That is exactly what happened with Lynn's remains. The tooth was not chosen because it was obvious. It was valuable because it was resilient. Inside it was information. And information is what investigators needed. Once the DNA profile was obtained, the blood in the vehicle could be connected to Lynn. The connection strengthened the prosecution's reconstruction. The tooth had become a bridge between two separate pieces of evidence. On one side was the victim. On the other was the vehicle. Between them was DNA. That bridge was invisible, but scientifically measurable. And that is why it became so powerful. Years later, the story of the case would still carry the image of fire. Fire is what people remember. The burned dumpster. The damaged remains. The horror of the discovery. But investigators remember something else. The tooth. Because the tooth represents the moment when the destruction stopped being complete. It was the surviving fragment. The exception. The crack in the killer's plan. The evidence that proved the flames had not won.
There is also a deeper lesson about time.
Time often works against homicide investigations. Witnesses forget. Records disappear. Buildings change. Vehicles are destroyed. People move. Memories become unreliable. But biological evidence can remain. If preserved properly, DNA can survive for decades. That means a crime scene can continue speaking long after the people involved have stopped talking. Lynn's case demonstrated that principle dramatically. The victim could no longer speak. The suspect could offer explanations. Witnesses could remember. But the DNA provided an independent biological connection. It did not need to be persuaded. It did not need to remember. It simply existed. And that is perhaps why forensic evidence can be so unsettling. It is indifferent to human narratives. A person can say one thing. DNA can say another. A person can claim innocence. A bloodstain can remain. A person can claim they never knew the victim. An object may prove otherwise. A person can say a vehicle was somewhere else. Investigators can establish where it actually was. Physical evidence does not care about reputation. It does not care about ambition. It does not care about appearances. It only reflects what happened to the material itself. For Lynn Breeden, that material told a devastating story. A young woman was killed. Her body was burned. Her blood remained.
Her tooth survived.
Her DNA was recovered. Her identity was established. Her killer was prosecuted. And the legal system reached a verdict. But the case still carries a strange sense of incompleteness. Not because the murderer went unidentified. He did not. Not because the evidence failed. It did not. But because no investigation can fully reconstruct a human life from the remains left behind. The scientific record tells us about the crime. It does not tell us everything about the person. That is why remembering the victim matters. Lynn should not exist only as a DNA profile. She should not exist only as a photograph attached to a murder case. She was a person before she became evidence. And the tragedy of homicide is that the public often meets the victim only after the worst thing has happened. The investigation begins after life has ended. The first photograph shown to the public may be a missing person image. The next may be a courtroom exhibit. The next may be forensic evidence. The victim's ordinary life becomes overshadowed by extraordinary violence. Yet somewhere before that night, Lynn had been living an ordinary existence. Working. Meeting people. Making decisions. Laughing. Arguing. Planning. Living. That is the life the crime interrupted. The investigation could recover DNA. It could recover evidence. It could establish responsibility. But it could not recover time. And perhaps that is the final paradox of the case. Science recovered what the fire tried to destroy. But science could not recover what death had taken. It could recover identity. It could recover evidence. It could recover a connection. But it could not recover Lynn. The tooth was powerful precisely because it was so small. It represented what remained. And what remained was enough. Enough for identification. Enough for comparison. Enough to strengthen the prosecution. Enough to help establish the truth. That is why the case remains a striking example of forensic persistence. The crime seemed designed to create a dead end. Instead, every attempted act of concealment produced another question. Why the fire? Why the dumpster? Why the gasoline? Why the movement of the body? Why the possession of Lynn's property? Why the attempted bank withdrawal? Why the blood? Why the weapon? And why did the DNA connect the blood to Lynn? Each question pulled investigators deeper. And at the center of those questions was a simple fact. Lynn had been murdered. Someone was responsible. The fire had not changed that. It had only made the evidence harder to find. Investigators found it anyway. Not all of it. Not every answer. But enough. And sometimes, in a homicide investigation, enough is the difference between a name on a missing person report and a conviction in a courtroom. The fire had almost erased Lynn Breeden. Almost. But the final word belongs to that word. Almost. Because almost erased is not erased. And the evidence that survived was enough to tell the world that Lynn had not vanished without a trace. She had left one behind. Hidden inside a tooth. Waiting for science to find it.